Good morning, everyone. Hope you had a great bank holiday weekend and are looking forward today. I know I'm looking forward to it. It's just amazing to see how this webinar has grown and developed. So we started off about 2 years ago. The idea of it was that it's just going to be a knowledge sharing platform that we can pass off some of our experiences, some things we've learned, because we do this every single day. So we are deep in it. So we just thought we'd share some info. And since the very first webinar, I've seen that some people have attended every single one. Some of you have attended about 90%, and there's also some new faces. It's great to see, so welcome to everyone. Off the back of these webinars, the best part is that I'll often get a call or an email and someone will say, wow, I didn't even think of that, and that was so interesting. I'm going to ask my team immediately if they're working on this. So it's just great to see how it sparks conversation and it gets people thinking. It just creates a bit of food for thought. If you are anything like me and struggle to take notes whilst listening to a recording, then don't worry about it. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. We're going to send through this recording at the end of it. And also, you please feel free to share to anyone who you think might enjoy it. Someone may have missed it, but they would be interested. So share it to as many people as you'd like. Also, in the right-hand side, there's going to be a little box for questions. So if you have any questions, just put them in there and we'll get to them at the end. So what is today's webinar about? Well, the theme is resilience, resilience, and resilience. There are 6 key points that we're going to discuss. The first being the importance of resilience. When people say resilience, you often say, oh, that's a bit expensive. That's a bit of waste of money. That's time consuming. All these negative things sort of flood to mind. But the importance of it, I can't express how important it is. What if something were to go wrong? Have you thought of it? These are the things we want to talk about today, just to get you thinking a bit more about why it's so important. Next up, we're going to talk about BCDC, which is another acronym that gets thrown around in this industry amongst the other couple 100,000. This stands for business continuity and disaster recovery. Basically, what happens if something goes wrong? Have you firstly thought about it? Do you have a plan? Are there steps, procedures, and policies for what to do if something goes wrong? Hopefully nothing does happen, but what if it does? Are you just going to take it as it comes, see what happens? I wouldn't recommend that. So that's why we want to talk about what to do. Then we're going to talk about the single points of failures within an organization. Within this sector, the companies and organizations are huge. There can be different divisions, companies, different entities in different countries. There could be this tiny little asset sitting in the back room, in the corner of your mind, in a basement that you don't think about. You often tend to think about the big ticket items that if they fail, then what would happen? But it doesn't necessarily have to be these enormous big ticket items. It could be something very small that you might not have considered. When we're saying build resilience, you're probably sitting there thinking, okay, great, I know I need to, but where do I actually start? What we're going to talk about today is the key areas to focus on, the bases to cover. We want to give you the fundamentals, the areas to build up from the start. And then from there, over the upcoming months, weeks, and years, you can slowly build up your resilience to a point where it's perfectly planned for any disasters. A lot of this is theory and it's conceptual. So we're going to talk about what we actually do and how we've actually helped customers and some real life examples. I know for me, I find it easier to understand things if I hear examples rather than concepts or ideas. So I've noticed there's quite a few new faces here. So I'm going to just give you a high level overview of what Bedrock are and who we are. Well, we manage mission critical IT and operational technology for highly regulated organizations across the UK. I can see in the corner of my screen that Mick is itching to go, and I can feel the anticipation building within the room. So I don't want to keep him too much longer. So I'm going to hand over to Mick now.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thanks you very much, Dylan, for the introduction. So yes, we're going to be talking about resilience today. And I'm going to start off by talking about why resilience is important and also what is it, first and foremost. First and foremost, it's the ability to withstand any problems or issues that may arise. And also, it's also the ability to recover from any problems or issues that arise, because they do happen. As much as we can try and have that ability to withstand and we can plan, there may be some that happen, and our ability to recover from them is something that's really important. It's a key part of your business continuity and disaster recovery plan. So yeah, if a site isn't generating or gas isn't flowing, your business is losing money, and therefore it's really important that being resilient allows you to anticipate issues and risks, and also having plans that can reduce that mean time to recover or resolve, depending on how you term it. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about the difference between resilience and redundancy, because some people seem to think it's either the same thing, or when we talk about resilience, some people may think we're talking about redundancy. So redundancy is that principle of often having primary, secondary systems. So maybe that's two separate pieces of equipment, separate hardware, cables, power sources, cabinets, whatever that is, dual internet connections, for example. That's what redundancy will often be, and we'll be looking a little bit at that later. But also we're going to be looking at resilience. That's the main thing. So how resilient are you to those potential issues and problems? What processes, procedures, tasks can be performed to ensure you've got that required resilience? And what does that mean for you guys and your mean time to resolution? There's lots of accreditations and things like that that help with those procedures and processes. ISO 27001, 9001, things like that in the IT arena. Things like NIST in terms of cybersecurity, and of course 62443 and NCSC's CAF in terms of OT security. So yeah, they can help shape and inform what those procedures, processes and checklists look like, and also how to audit and improve upon them. Really important. And can we test them? So yeah, for example, regular tested backups as part of a BCDR plan means you can recover from an error or a failure within, say, 48 hours. And that might be a level of risk and business resilience that you're okay with. And that's just an example of that. Redundancy is just a part of being resilient, really. So yeah, it can help you be more clever with your SCADA and electronic security budgets, of course. So having clever resilient solutions and processes, procedures mean the cost to deliver a site could be less, ensuring therefore, you've got a much more chance of that being greenlit at that FID stage for those people who do get involved in those financial investment decision stages. So what is a BC&DR plan? It basically helps organizations prepare for disruptive events, known ones or potential ones that we're aware of. What happens if this piece of equipment fails? What happens if this internet goes? What happens if something happens to a building in whatever manner? It helps organizations prepare for that. And depending on the job you do, you may be more involved in that in others, and actually be involved in areas that you don't even think are to do with that. So for example, you may be asked to provide documents on how equipment is configured. You may documents on how backups and restorations are performed. You may also therefore be involved in testing that plan without knowing it, such as updating any systems based on pen tests. Maybe you're conducting tests during outages, or maybe when there's not outages for some people whose systems run 24/7 and never have the ability to have an outage. So yeah, it means that you've got the ability to continue your business operations with little or no disruption, depending on how well and the kind of things you put in place, minimizing that risk of any type of events, either natural ones, any kind of, there's some big things there, natural and man-made disasters, but they could be anything really. So why would you have one? Well, one of the main reasons probably is because it can be part of compliance, part of regulations, GDPR, complying with your business insurances. There's lots of reasons why you might have one from a compliance perspective, but there's also from a cost. How much financial cost would it be to recover from a potential issue or disaster? Something could be small, like a small piece of equipment failure, but something could be bigger, which includes loss of data, loss of configuration. That means systems stop working, and also loss of reputation for a business, of course. If the systems go offline, and we know about some of those usually in the news, it's not necessarily to do with maybe systems or devices, but yeah, you know, any kind of cyber kind of attacks and things like that are obviously the most newsworthy. But there are others where, you know, oh, this has been offline for an amount of time, and it may not necessarily be a cyber attack. It may be that servers have failed, databases have failed, gone corrupted, and therefore take an amount of time to bring back around again, and it's the cost of reputation of the business. So yeah, those without a plan usually find it extremely difficult or cannot survive or recover from those major disasters. The effects on large-scale disasters can shut down businesses, and even if they are able to get out of it, they can often be out of business within 12 months, either because of the financial cost of getting back from that disaster or that problem, or that financial that reputation to the business as well. So when you start creating one, for some of you, you may not be involved too much in the higher level, but for some others, you may be, and you may be involved in lots of different ways. So first, assessing the state of the business. So that'll be the current state of an organization, identifying threats, setting the priorities for any remediation. Could be looking at wider issues around locations, individuals without whom the business wouldn't be able to function, and things like that. Identifying locations, including identifying where business critical data and assets are stored, that are part of the crucial objectives of your planning. It will also help recovery staff start to understand what the recovery process might look like in terms of where things are and how we get to them. Finding weaknesses and providing solutions. There will be some weaknesses that you'll come up with, whether that's, okay, we've only got one server here, or we've only got one network connection, or we've only got this. And yeah, you'll come up with some things yourselves, and it's coming up with solutions for that. And some of that might be some things we talk about later, and being able to address those gaps. And if anyone's aware of things like the risk bucket, where we start off with a big bucket of risk, we'll put some mitigations in place. There'll still be some risk left. We may look at making some mitigations again, and we'll bring down that risk to an acceptable level. And that's kind of what we're helping to do here, is get it down to an acceptable level. We want to review and test the plan. So we're going to review that potentially on a yearly basis. Anyone who has an outage, that's probably what they're doing. You know, they are testing whatever the BC and DR plan is, alongside some of your maintenance and another type thing activities that are happening during that period. But there will be some testing of that plan, because often with the outage, it's the only time where you can realistically do that. Things like cutting over to backup systems, whatever that might be. Know your recovery teams. So knowing who they are, what their roles and responsibilities are, how they will help and manage through a recovery period is also important to the plan as well, because being able to understand who everyone is, who the stakeholders are, where the documentation is really, really important. So knowing who would be responsible for certain things. So let's move on and have a little bit of a look at single points of failure. I don't spend too much time on this, simply because of the fact that it kind of leads itself to redundancy for various reasons. And we're more talking about resilience here, aren't we? So yeah, as modern OT systems, SCADA systems, telephony systems, and those types of things move more towards IP-based systems, traditional SCADA engineers want to try and apply the same principles that they would have done in terms of maybe having, say, two PLCs or RTUs connected up to a piece of equipment, separate cabling back to systems and things like that, and having literally separate systems. In an IP world, potentially could be expensive. We're talking about double the amount of kit physically, especially if your hardware needs to comply with some kind of regulations such as 61850, which things like environmental controls on those, but they do have some other stuff such as the types of power they'll accept, communication methods that they can utilize, and we'll talk a bit about that later. So yeah, that hardware can be expensive. So using twice as much of it can be even more expensive. Modern OT networks can utilize modern IT-based resilience and redundancy techniques, things like spanning tree, redundancy ring technologies, and those type things to give resilience to systems. So we not necessarily have to double up on things. And we're going to have a little look at kind of the types of techniques that you can use. However, modern IT networks, as some of you appreciate, may not be appropriate for all systems. So things like intertripping signals and things like that might require more stringent delays. Some IT systems and things like that, the resiliency, spanning tree and stuff, there are maximum delays that the system can tolerate, and that might be too high for intertripping. And therefore, having devices that are adhering to 61850, as I said, they also, not only is it about things like temperature ranges, the types of power, it's also about other types of signals that can be sent via these devices that wouldn't via a traditional IT switch that are designed for SCADA, things like goose messaging, that type of thing. So therefore, instead of using an IED sending, receiving information that gets converted to TCP/IP, which is how things get around an IT network, it can communicate in goose, reducing that delay slightly. We can also use switches that use redundancy and resilience protocols that are designed for SCADA, and these two, HSR and PRP functions, are kind of examples of that. HSR mimics more like old SCADA transmission, where we can have two networks and we can send the data at the same time down both, which if anyone works in a traditional IT environment, they'll be like, what? That's not something we do normally in an IT environment. We can have resiliency, but not at the same time. PRP, that kind of is an extension of what works in a traditional IT environment, where you might have a ring of devices, of switches, network switches, and what PRP can do is send the data around the ring, around both sides of the ring. So it's kind of a bit of a compromise between HSR, which may need twice as much equipment, more like the old SCADA way of sending signals, and modern IT networks where we may be using spanning tree, which means actually the data is only going via one path. So let's have a look at how you can build resilience into your systems. We can design with redundancy in mind, like we said. So there might be redundancy of systems, redundancy of networks, redundancy of power. And like we said, that might mean doubling up on equipment or creating server clusters, those types of things. Could some of those systems be controlled elsewhere, making things like power, network redundancy, server redundancy less of a concern? Now, if we're managing that within a data center, for example, some of those types of things are inherently built into the data center, and therefore heating, cooling, power, all that good stuff is kind of taken care of, and we don't need to worry about it. How can we build resilience in mind instead? You know, you might have dual power supplies. Do they both need to be UPS'd? Do we trust on-site generators to take over with enough time that on-site servers are not compromised, for example, and we don't have brownouts? Can spares be an option? Keeping spare equipment, you know, if you're in a security system, maybe cameras, maybe spare hardware such as switches, modems, routers, whatever they are, we could keep spares, and as part of our DR and BC plan, we can have backups that are tested against those spares, for example. So looking at power, prioritize stabilizing it, really important. Controlled shutdown, you know, if you've got servers, especially if they're based on operating systems like Windows, Linux, other sorts of things, controlling the shutdown of those is really important. Anyone from an IT background knows if you keep pulling the power on a server and just pulling the power, it will eventually break that device. And also alerting if there's any problems. Designing appropriate UPS capacity might be for just controlled shutdown. Some people think UPS, oh, we've got to keep everything up for 4 hours. If you've got a generator, we may only put enough in for, say, 30 minutes or less. It's enough to let the generator kick in. It's enough for us to get signaling back to say there's been a problem with power and to control shut down the servers if required. Assess the requirements for dual and single fed UPS, and also being able to monitor that so that we can be alerted of power issues. Potentially if there's a device issue, we can reboot it remotely. The image on the right there is an example of a service that we provide to some people. So we provide the UPS, we provide the power rails. What we also do is connect them up via, in this case, 5G back to our data center. It's completely independent of any systems they've got on site. And you can see from here we have a UPS and a non-UPS. We have an separate power supplies, but one is UPS fed and one isn't to devices. And we've got the ability to remotely turn things on and off remotely if required. But you can see there where we've got a balance between redundancy and resilience. We're not having to put in twice as many UPSs. We're not putting in a whole rack of them that is going to last 16 hours. So yeah, it's creating that balance. Prioritize a network design that's resistant to any failures. So as you can see, the drawing on the left, we've got some IEDs and we've got a SCADA server system at the back and a HMI. In terms of our network switches in there, we can see that they're big switches connected to each other. So if we talk about how can we make that more resilient, yes, we could put two switches in at the top, 2 switches at the bottom and make it more resilient. That is obviously redundancy, putting in 2 of them. But of course, if we put in big switches like that, might cost a lot. So on the right there, a decision was made to, let's put in smaller switches. Let's do that. And then what we will do is we will stagger the IEDs between those switches. So the cost of those 2 small switches will be not a lot more than the 1 big one. But it will do is suddenly give us more resilience. If we lose 1 switch, the data can still get around because we can see from the little orange bars, we've still got that loop in the network. Yes, we may lose half the IEDs in this example, but we'll still have some system that works and we will have the ability to get in there and recover from that. So that there is an example of where we can look at a design that is more resilient to failure than the one on the left. We can look at building resilience into our systems. So big subject, big topic. It depends what's lying on top of the network, doesn't it? So for example, in terms of a telephony and security system, maybe it is dual PBXs, maybe it is doing something slightly different. Just as a little side note for those people who do have telephony and things like that and a bit worried about their backup BT system, manual telephones, ISDN and that stuff, BT's moved back their cut-off date from September 25 to December 2027. So people have a little bit more time to deal with that. They're not necessarily putting back their stop sell. That's where they literally stop selling those services in that area, but they have put back the cut-off point, which means in terms of people who do have BT manual phone lines, just in case, you do have some time to deal with that. So yeah, it could be that you've got backup VoIP. You've got an online VoIP system that you've got as a backup that's on a PBX. It's got an internet connection. It'll work if your main PBX and its connectivity goes offline, for example. Yes, we can use dual clusters. Maybe we think about servers with dual fed power, RAID controlled hard drives. Can they be monitored? And therefore we know if that's got a failure quickly, because we can put in big servers and arrays and things, but if you're not monitoring it, then actually quite a lot can go wrong, and you may as well have, be clever. You could put in a smaller piece of equipment with dual power, redundant hard drives, make sure it's monitored, regular backups are taken of it, and it could be tested on spare equipment, and you can be doing that type of thing instead. Think about spares. As you say, they may become more useful when scaling. So if you've got multiple sites, we always try to design using the same or similar equipment. So therefore, you could have a small amount of spares that covers multiple sites. And as long as part of that plan, you are backing up your devices and you are testing those potentially on your spares, then you can quickly grab a spare, put that into use and get yourself recovered relatively quickly. So yeah, as we said, other areas of compromise, for example, in CCTV, yes, you could put in dual recorders that fail over and back up to each other. Yes, it's the most robust in terms of your resilience and but also it's also got costing them up the most, isn't it? Because it's got the most amount of equipment. Whereas if you've got 10 sites, you could put 1 recorder in each, maybe keep a backup one, so in the event of a failure that you can then have that be put into position. With some of our customers, we are doing things like that, but we're also, for example, putting a spare recorder in at our data center for them. So bandwidth you've got bandwidth coming across the internet if it were to be used, but it would mean that that takes over the recording for any of their multiple sites that they've got. The most important thing, though, is whatever you decide, it's documented, it's auditable, and you can test against it. Really, really important. It's all brilliant having these things, but if nobody's ever done any of those, and when it goes wrong, you're like, oh, the configurations are corrupt, or the documentation is not cohesive enough so that anyone could really get a piece of equipment, put a configuration on it, and get it back to working condition. Then that still is complex, and it may not have existed. So yeah, being able to audit and test against it is really, really important. So coming back around, how have we helped people? Things like with Bedrock Capture, which is more of our site security kind of plan that we've got in our service. We obviously want to support people building long-term, building resiliency into their systems and making sure it fits in terms of budget and in terms of the amount of risk that you're prepared to take. So yeah, the reason why things like these types of things are great are because certain things that you might have in terms of monitoring, backups, testing, and things like that, we do all that in the data center already, and it's provable as well. So as part of your BC and DR planning, we can then give those guys any information that they need regarding that proactive monitoring, maintenance. Whoops, the bounced a bit there. And SLAs that go alongside it as well. So you know that a problem will be dealt with in a certain time frame. Again, great for your BR and DC planning. In terms of that BC and DR planning, some people, obviously, if they're like, gosh, that is a huge amount of information and things to look at and be able to work with. In terms of your systems, whether that be OT, on-site security, whether that's DMZ related, so remote access, we can certainly help with that planning as well as delivering those systems. That's great in terms of us consulting on that. In terms of cyber, obviously, the earlier the better, because sometimes what you then decide to put in and how you decide to do that can differ. We can help with creating those processes, those procedures, any O&M activities that you're going to be doing over the period, whether that's 5 years, 10 years, whatever it is. For your net resilience, system resilience, looking at PPMs with you guys and what you might do, either we would do for you or you would do yourselves on set periods and things like that. We can also provide cyber risk assessments as well, either in an IT environment in terms of ISO 27001 and that type of stuff. We can certainly make sure you align to 62443 or the NCSC's CAF, which is a cyber assessment framework. It's a lot of these systems and a lot of these frameworks are designed. People have come up with ways of doing things, and they're not completely different and separate. They have many overlaps and and ways and good ways of working, and therefore we can align to either of those, and in fact they'll probably pretty much be the same. For anyone who has absolutely nothing and maybe has a few concerns about certainly your security posture, but certainly anything else, things like Cyber Essentials are a really good starting point. It looks at simple practical things, and it's a simple checklist. Are you backing up? And it takes different things like firewalls or switches or servers or email or whatever that is, and it'll say, have you done this? Has it got dual power? Do you do backups? Do you restore them? It's all those types of things, and it's very much a question approach like that. Very practical in the way that you do it, and it's a fantastic way to reduce risk and therefore become more resilient. And people who do it, they're 80% less likely to make a claim on insurance for cyber or outage or anything of that nature, if just by having it or even doing it. So yeah, if anyone's like, oh gosh, I don't even know where to start with that, come and speak to us. Get in touch with Dylan, and of course we'll be able to come along and help out. So with that in mind, does anyone have any questions?
Yes, we do. Thanks, Mick. That was really good. I'm sure everyone enjoyed that as much as I did. So we do have a couple of questions, about 5. So the first one being, what level of detail should you go into for your BC-DR plan, or is this dependent on the level of risk the organization is willing to take?
Yeah, as I say, it will depend. That kind of thing will probably depend on where you are, as in, is it an engineer, is it a manager, is it the FD, so as detailed as you can is basically it, and it can be quite overwhelming, can't it? If anyone, I know in the past when we've either been doing our own or we've been working with our clients, you get within people in the same room will have a different angle as to how to look at that question. It was like, well, what? Let's start with the building blowing up. I've heard that one before, and you're like, oh, okay. and then there'll be something, yeah, well, what happens if that router fails and that switch fails and that server does something? And so you get two ends of a spectrum. I think following the plan of looking at your primary locations, look at where your information and data is held and things like that is your first start. And then when it gets down to it, the relevant people, so your techies, they will get down into their bit of detail and other people will get into their detail. So the bottom line is probably as much as you can give.
Right, thank you. Okay, next one. What tends to be the industry standard for downtime? Is it 24 hours, 48, or is this dependent on the risk we as a business are willing to take?
Yeah, it would definitely be down to the risk you're willing to take. You know, I talked about one where if you've been taking backups of a server, and anyone who knows servers will know this, if you're taking backups and then it goes corrupted, then it could be depends on the size of the server, but it could take 24 to 48 hours to get that thing back working again. And that might not be enough. So therefore you may have to, therefore you would do other things, whether that's building a cluster or even, okay, we're going to build everything virtual. It's still going to be a piece of metal that sits in our premises, but it will be virtual. And therefore potentially the ability to basically take a snapshot from an earlier period and put that on would be quicker than rebuilding a physical operating system, so to speak. Yeah. So yeah, that's something we would help with. We would come up with the options and look at that. I mean, it depends what it is, isn't it? Like for some of those that we know of that have got critical CN icons, it might be 30 minutes. So whatever that connectivity is between their locations might be 30 minutes, after which point they have to shut down systems because their SCADA that's monitoring, say, a valve or wherever it would be, they're no longer able to do that.
Right, okay, thank you. Next one. You mentioned spares. What would you recommend? 10%, 20%?
I would. So the percentage depends on the amount of sites, doesn't it? Yeah. So you'd probably be aiming for about 10%. But of course, if you only had one site, that it might look like more than that. But once you get to say you're aiming for about 10%, and that might mean you have a bulk of spares, and that might see you through. And if you're building new sites, you may go through sites 1. And you keep adding them, get up to about 10, and then right, okay, now we're slipping down to 9% or 8% spares. Now we're going to buy extra of certain elements, and it would be based on the amount of things you have. So it would be 10% of, say, a model of camera or 10% of a model of switch. It would be that.
Yes. Okay. And last question for the day. You mentioned Cyber Essentials. Is Cyber Essentials Plus necessary, or will Cyber Essentials suffice for now as a baseline for us?
I would always say do the first one first, because it will set a really good standard, a really good baseline, and then it will allow you to take the next steps. Because if you go straight into Essentials Plus, then you may find you've got more gaps to fulfill. So, for example, the main differences are around the fact that somebody will come and do an assessment on Essentials Plus, and therefore you're paying for all that. Whereas if you're doing it Essentials first, where you are doing that baseline and making sure things are correct, then you stand a much better chance of being able to do Essentials Plus.
And that's our last question, Mick. So thank you very much for that.
Brilliant, thank you.
So for those of you who don't know, our next webinar will be in August. So we'll send out invites and we'll send out the recordings that we have done for this event. So yeah, feel free to join and pass along the invite if you think anyone would be interested in it.
Yeah, definitely. And if anyone's got any subjects, so if there's things, obviously we do cover things in our webinars, and if you need to look at previous ones, you can do on the website or reach out to Dylan. But if anyone does have anything that they feel, oh, I'm unsure about this, I'd be really curious if you could talk about that, then yeah, reach out to Dylan, give us those things, and obviously it could come up in August webinar.
Yeah. And thanks for joining, everyone. So let me know if you have any questions, reach out to me, and yeah, we'll happily discuss anything you've learned or found interesting from this webinar. So have a good day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Yes, thank you. Goodbye.